Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to the Killer Women podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air Global Network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is Mary Kubica. Mary is the New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of many suspense novels. A former high school history teacher, Mary holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, in history and American literature. She lives outside of Chicago with her husband and 2 children. Mary's novels have been selected as Amazon Best Books of the Month and have been library read selections. They've been translated into over 30 languages and have sold over 2 million copies worldwide. She's been described as a hell of a storyteller, Kirkus Reviews, and a writer of Vice-like Control, the Chicago Tribune. And her novels have been praised as hypnotic by People and thriller and illuminating by the Los Angeles Times. She is currently working on her next novel. Welcome, Mary.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
It's so great to be here. So we are here to talk about Just the Nicest Couple, which I love the title too. It's like you're good girl. All your titles are, they mean the opposite of what's you're actually going to learn in the book, which I love. There's some irony there. So tell our listeners about Just the Nicest Couple, Mary.
Yeah, absolutely. So Just the Nicest Couple is actually about 2 different couples. First, we meet Christian and Lily, and they're just like your perfect couple. You know, they're happily married. They're very much in love. They've just recently bought the home of their dreams. And Lily is pregnant after dealing with infertility for a number of years. She finally has a viable pregnancy. And so they're just really optimistic about their future and, so excited to start their family. Nina and Jake, on the other hand, have a marriage that's very much on the rocks. They're kind of always at each other's throats. Jake works as a neurosurgeon, so he has, long, stressful hours. And when he's home, he's still not like mentally present. His work just really weighs heavily on him. And Nina too has been kind of pulled in multiple directions. She's an only child, and her mother is getting older and starting to have some health issues. One of which is that she's slowly losing her vision. And so she relies on Nina more and more for help and rides, to the grocery store and church and all sorts of things. And so that has an impact on their marriage as well. And Jake has some feelings about the amount of time that Nina spends with her mother. So there's just a lot of conflicts there. And then one night, Jake doesn't come home from work, and Nina's just sure that it has something to do with an argument they had the night before. It was, a big, ugly blow up. And, she thinks that he's gone somewhere to blow off steam and he'll be back in a couple days. But, then one day turns into 2 days and 5 days. And some things happen in that time that make her think there's more to it than that, that Jake isn't just at a hotel or at a friend's house, like maybe something has happened to him. Lily, on the other hand, the other woman, is pretty sure that she's the last one to see Jake before he went missing. So she confesses to her own husband, Christian, what happens. And Christian decides, that he will do anything to prevent the truth from coming out. He will do anything to protect his wife and their unborn child. And so it becomes, this cat and mouse game. One woman who is desperate to find her missing husband, and then another couple who will do anything to stop that from happening.
Yes, and it is a series of twists and turns until the very, very last page, which is very merry and very fun. So can you tell us, Mary, was there specific inspiration? How do you come up with your twisty ideas?
Yeah, it always just starts as like a small seed of an idea. It's never, ever fully formed. And I'm not a plotter. I'm not an outliner. So I go into it, a little blind, not knowing where the story is going to lead. And so, after the fact, after everything happens and the book is done and has gone through multiple rounds of revision and all that, sometimes it's hard to think, think back, as to what was that first idea that came to me. But I start most of my books like with a problem that needs to be solved, And so with this one, I think it really just was this idea I liked the idea of a missing husband, because I feel like we read so often about missing wives. So I liked the idea of mixing that up a little bit. So I wanted this missing husband, and I wanted this other woman that, was involved, but we as the reader aren't, quite privy to the whole story. It kind of is revealed in bits and pieces. So I just started there. And in this book, we have two narrators, Christian and Nina. And so I never write any of my books in the same way that you would read them. I always just take one of my narrators and write his or her story in their entirety before going back and picking up with another narrator. So with this book,
Interesting. That's really interesting. Okay. So who did you write first then?
I started with Christian. That story was just kind of speaking louder to me at the moment. So I started with him, and I do it that way because I don't know, I love my characters. I want my characters to be just like as fully fleshed out as I can make them. So I feel like if I just focus on one and I'm not bouncing back and forth between narrators from chapter to chapter, I can just like really get inside their heads. So I started with Christian, and again, like I didn't know who he was as a character. I didn't know who Lily was as a character, and then little by little, Christian reveals more about his wife to us. And so I just started writing, and I thought, okay, well, Lily is upset, and then she makes this confession to Christian. And then, so what are they going to do? What are they going to do about that? And so I just let the story kind of naturally flow and lead me. And as I do, I'm really focused on the chapter I'm writing, but I think my mind is starting to like jump ahead a couple chapters, like what's going to happen next. And at some point during the process, I come up with the twist, and it's so rare for me to know it when I begin, because I think that I need to create the story, and I need to get to know those characters before I know like what their true motivations are.
And it kind of makes the twist, if the twist is surprising to you, then it makes it more surprising to the reader. I think that, that's true of I'm not a plotter either. Although I often think I wish I was, because I think in some ways it seems like it would be more straightforward. So I'm really curious about this, writing one character at a time. So I just want to go back for a second. So when you're doing that, you're in Christian's point of view the whole way through to the very end. And then but you must be thinking like, okay, well, Nina will fill in this blank, and because there's so many things that without the 2 points of view, we don't get the full picture. How do you manage that? Are you just sort of thinking, well, somebody else will have to answer that question? Or
yeah, so it sounds so messy every time that I like describe it, and sometimes it is. Sometimes I'm thinking, oh my gosh, and the edits can be heavy. Once I merge these two or more stories back together, the edits can be quite extensive. But yeah, so there are times, when I'm writing Christian and I think, okay, I can see how this other character, Nina in this case, is gonna like weave into this story. So sometimes I'll just, like go on a blank document and kind of write down some notes for myself, so I have them. The real fun, I think, happens when I'm writing like the second storyline. And then, then I'll jump back into Christian's document and really kind of like start to weave those two together a little bit more. And then, literally when I'm done, I just take it to like FedEx and I print it off and start to piece this story back together. And then, like I said, there are many times that I have to move things around because things are being revealed at the wrong point. But I think, like you said earlier, like when I'm surprised and when I have that kind of aha moment, when I figure out how this story is going to come together, like I really hope that mirrors what the reader feels when they get to that point in the book, because it's like one of my favorite parts about writing.
Yeah, and the thing that's wonderful too about Just the Nicest Couple is that Nina and Lily are good friends. So, and they work together, they're teachers, which you have experience with. So that is, that ups all the stakes for everybody involved, right? Because it's not just two random couples. Their lives are somewhat meshed, particularly the women. So that is really interesting. Well, so have you always done it this way? That sort of one at a time?
Yeah, I have. And it was like by accident with my first book, The Good Girl, I did that. I think it was more of necessity maybe at the time, because that book, there's 3 narrators, but there's also different time frames. There's like chapters called before and after. So it was like, not only was I dealing with the narrators, but also different points in time. and just really trying to make each of the characters' voices unique. And so I felt like I was kind of struggling to keep it all together, just to keep it all
Mm-hmm.
straight. And so at that time, it was, I think I just made a conscious decision, like, okay, I'm going to take this narrator in the before scenes and just write that, and then I'll do something else. And so I did it like that. And when I was done, I just felt like, for one, I could really grasp who my characters were. It
Yeah.
was also plot, because again, it was like non-linear. So this way I was able to just really focus on a time, like what is happening now. And when I
Right.
put it all back together and just saw like how it all read, then when it was pieced back together, I loved
Mm-hmm.
it. So it
Yeah.
was one of those things that, happened necessity, but I just found that it really worked for me.
That's fabulous. And it's interesting that Christian came to you first, that
Yeah.
I always think about like, I always think of our women characters and and I like that I love that it's one of the couples you're in the man's point of view and one you're in the women's point of view. So we really don't necessarily know what's going on in Lily's mind, right? Or obviously Jake who's missing. But I think that also raises the sort of the stakes and the pace and everything. So that's fine. One of the things I think there's a theme in this book, and you also, I think, is a theme, for instance, in Good Girl and some of your other books, is sort of how well do we really know the people that we love, that we live with. Can you talk about sort of what about that appeals to you?
Yeah, yeah, and I think that there's probably some element of that in every book that I have written. And I just think that it's so it happens. We can only know as much about another person as they're willing to reveal to us, and it doesn't matter if it's, just an acquaintance or if it's your spouse. You really only know so much about them. And I think, in this genre, this domestic suspense, everything is just so close to home. I'm writing about spouses and children and best friends and next door neighbors and things like that. So I just love that idea, that just you don't know everybody right around you. And I think that it's super relatable. I think that that's what readers of domestic suspense love, is that, all these characters are really just they're everyday ordinary characters that are put in these really extreme situations. And so I think that readers enjoyed that they could, those characters could be them, just, like once removed.
Right, in a really unfortunate moment, we could any of
Right.
us be, right, Lily or Nina. That's true. Well, I noticed I always read the acknowledgments. I usually read the acknowledgments before the book, unless somebody warns me, unless it says something, don't do this because it'll ruin the book. But I love to sort of see, who we thank in the end of our books and all that. And I noticed you thank Pete and Addison and Aiden for quote your patience and your willingness to talk about this book and all the false starts that came before it again and again and again. So that was, of course, that's like that, we get so much sort of insight. I love acknowledgments for that.
Yeah.
So tell us about so it sounds like, I'm assuming those are your kids and your husband.
Yeah, yes, yes. That's Pete is my husband, and Addison and Aiden are my kids.
Okay. And do you talk about your books with the family?
I do. So, and you know what? They're 15 and 17 now, but to be totally honest, we were talking about this stuff at the dinner table when they were like 7 and 9.
Yeah.
Too, and but yeah, this book in particular, this is like my COVID book. And I think that all of us writers have one. And I had it was just that everything was different, of course, for everybody, not just writers, but for everybody over the last few years. And I started writing, not exactly the book that you have read, but I, started writing some version of this next book of mine. It was like April of 2020. I had just finished Local Women Missing, and right around the same time I had gone on tour for the book before it, The Other Misses. And then it was like time to start the next book, just at the same time that, my husband was working from home and the kids' school was going remote. And it was like my brain wasn't working. I love quiet when I write. I love to be alone in
Right.
the house. And I
I
didn't
hear
get
that.
that, for like the next at least year. I would say it was a solid year before my kids went back to school. And and I struggled, and it's just I struggled to connect with any characters. I struggled to really be able to like think through a plot. And so I had an idea early on. I sent a proposal to my editor. It was completely different than, this book. And my editor loved it. And I started writing, and I got like a third of the way into the book, only to realize it didn't have legs. I didn't like it. I couldn't connect with these characters. And so I set it aside, and I had kind of thought of another idea. So I sent another proposal to my editor. She loved it again. And the same thing happened. I felt so excited, but then I would get 20 or 30,000 words in, and again, realized the book had no legs. I couldn't connect with the characters. It was just like the same thing happening again and again. And I'd never experienced that, in my entire writing career. And I just think that everything was so different. I just really couldn't find my rhythm that I had like pre-COVID. And
Right.
you check Twitter, you turn on the news in the morning, and like the world was a hot mess. And it was just like, it just takes away your creativity. And so it was so hard to write during that time. And so I had a deadline of September of 2021. And so, which should have been plenty of time. That was like almost a year and a half when I started writing. It's more than I ever have. But I just, with all the
Right.
false starts, it just, my poor editor, she was so patient. There were times she would get on the phone with me, and we would just brainstorm any ideas we could think about. And it wasn't happening. So, that September deadline like came and went, and I was partway through another book that I didn't like. I wasn't feeling it. And I remember it was the end of October 2021 when I got the ideas for Just the Nicest Couple. And I still remember the moment I told my husband, I think I want to start over again. And he was like, what are you thinking? You're like already a month and a half, 2 months, like beyond your deadline. And I was like, no, this is the one. I could feel it. I don't know. I just was like starting to get, I don't know. I just really could feel it. So I didn't even tell my editor I was switching. I didn't turn in a proposal. I just started writing this book, and I wrote with like an urgency that I've never felt before. And I connected to Christian in particular so much right away. Like his story, I felt like just flowed out of me. And then once I had, the groundwork laid, it was pretty easy to get Nina's story in there too. And I remember it was like just after the New Year. So like 2.5-ish, 3 months after I started on it, that I sent a draft to my editor. And like, she had no idea what was coming, because I didn't even tell her that I had started over again. And so it was a horrible situation to go through, but also it was really exhilarating. When I finally found the right story, like I just loved to have that, like just to be able to write again and to have the words flow out of me and be so excited about it.
Right. And it does, even as, I always think of those, my kids are a little older than yours, but and they were also home. And I think about those parents who were dealing with little kids, right? I cannot, right? Like homeschooling elementary school kids and now I don't even know how people did that, but it was such a, and in some ways it was like being alone or being, not being able to go out was not that different from the rest of my life. I tend to like to be home. I tend to like to nest, but having all those people in your space, not having those sort of long gaps of just silence where you can stare out the window, or it really does, it affected so many people in that way.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
really, it knocked the wind out of us.
And I think as writers, we're naturally introverts, and we need that peace and quiet to just think. And when you don't have that, it takes its toll, and and I think, I'm not alone. I talk to so many authors that really struggled to write during that time. And I think that once everybody, got that COVID book out of the way, I just think it's like we got over this big hurdle.
It is really, it's so true. And so you really had 3 kind of false starts. You did 3 big books. Okay, so yeah, and I think that's an amazing thing to hear from somebody who's obviously so successful, is that it's not like once you know what you're doing, it's every book is the same. Of course it's not. Every book is different. Every period in your life and where your family is, it changes everything kind of all over. So it's right. You starting every book.
Right. It sure does, and I see like on Twitter or, whatever social media, I see so many authors say, okay, I'm starting my next book, do I know how to do this? And these are authors that have written 10, 20 books. And, I think that there's that excitement at starting a new project, but also fear. I mean, it's just like so many moving parts, and, it takes so long, of course, to write it. So it's like a big endeavor. But yeah, every single book, I think, provides its own, problems, its own challenges. And so it's one of those things, typically like you practice something and you just get better and better. But I don't know,
Yeah.
in some ways it is with writing, but in some ways it's not. No matter how many books you write, you're always going to have new challenges.
Because every story requires something a little different, right? Every characters require something different. Every story. That's absolutely right. So going back to sort of the family, I'm picturing you guys at dinner. Are you kind of like, well, what do you think of this twist, or how does that? I mean, are they sort of? Is everybody? Is it a sort of group think tank you got going on at the dinner table?
It really is, honestly. And I mean, they're so good to humor me. And I mean, sometimes they're like, enough, mom. Like, we don't want to talk about it anymore. But they're really, really good. And unfortunately, like my kids, as a result, don't want to read my books a lot because they know the twist. Like they've brainstormed ideas with me. They know exactly where it's going to go. So they will read my books. But it just, of course, like if you knew what the twist was in a book you were about to read, you're going to lose interest. Sometimes we actually kick my husband out of the conversation because he is one of my first readers. So like if we're going really, really spoilery, then I'll make him leave so that it'll at least be a surprise to him. But it's fun. And the kids, the Good Girl, my first book came out in 2014. So my daughter was 9, I think, and my son was 7. And, they would go to like literally every event locally with me. I mean, they had my whole like little spiel that I would give at bookstores and libraries memorized. And it was just, they were troopers, but it's just been so fun to like, for them to be such a part of the experience.
And are they big readers themselves?
My son is in particular. My daughter does like to read, but she's 17 now, and there's a social aspect, and
Of
just so many
course.
school classes right now. We're just so complicated, So if it's
know.
something outside of required reading, she's probably not reading it. But my son has always been a really big reader.
That's so fun. Well, I know it's funny how, and I didn't come to reading until a little bit later either, but it's fun to watch the kids read. And my son has not, I don't think he's ever read any of my books, but my daughter does read. But I like the idea that for you, it sounds like talking these things through really makes a huge difference in your process.
It does. And I don't talk widely, I have to say, like, I'll talk to my husband and kids, agent, editor, but beyond that, like I keep it pretty close, and the only people that read early drafts are my husband, my agent, and my editor. So I know like a lot of authors will share with a critique partner or a reading group, things like that. But I really do kind of keep it close. I feel like it's also subjective. And the more people you share with, you're just going to get that much more feedback. And then how do you filter through all that? So I do, I've learned to just like really trust that feedback from those couple people that I share it with. I am part of a book club. So like in the next stage, sometimes after my editor and I have done all the revisions, but it's not, into production yet, sometimes I will share it with a couple members from my book club, just because I think it's cool to get like an everyday reader's feedback to somebody in the industry. And that's always been really beneficial.
Yeah, it helps you tweak sort of some of the smaller points.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because obviously your editor and everybody else, once they've read it once, it's hard to have a fresh look at anything. And it's really hard for us, right? I mean, even putting it down for a month,
so hard because you know exactly where it's going. So you don't know, like, okay, these twists, are they going to fool a reader, or are they totally obvious? Like, you don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yours are not totally obvious. I can tell you that. Yours fool readers, clearly. And you also, I noticed, thank your sister for some brilliant suggestion. You probably can't tell us what that is because I imagine it's one of the twists. But so she must read for you as well.
Yeah, well, and that was more like a brainstorming. So she's actually only right now reading the finished book. So
fun. Okay.
But yeah, so she did help me with some brainstorming. So she knows some of where it's going, but she doesn't know the whole thing. So she's definitely in for a couple surprises.
Oh, fun. So okay, so with your a family and the career, aside from obviously the COVID time, which was not at all normal, what is your what does a day in the life of Mary look like?
Yeah, so it's kind of changed over the years, mostly dependent on the kids' schedules. When I first started, when I sold The Good Girl and then my next book was under contract, I know my son was still in preschool, like 4 hours a week. So, I mean, how do you write a book in that?
Right.
So I started back then waking up at like 5 every day, and I would write from usually 5 to 7. That's about the time the kids would get up back then. And at the time, it was like those 2 hours were the only writing time that I had. Now they're in high school. Their school day starts at 7, so they're out the door around 6:30. It's crazy.
It's crazy. Yeah.
I know. And then they both do after school activities. So they're not home until like 4. So I have this whole day really to myself to write, but I still love to write in the morning. That's my favorite time of day. And honestly, because they're up by like 5:30-ish. Sometimes I was 5 o'clock, like just doesn't get it done. So there are days like when I'm really in the groove, I'll wake up at 4 and write from like 4 to 5:30. And there's really no need for it. Like I have a whole day to write, but there's something that I love so much about those early morning hours. Like I am more fresh at 4 in the morning than I am at noon. And I can't explain it.
Yeah. But I have heard, I'm not a morning person, so this does not apply, but I have heard that there's kind of like you're almost half asleep. So there's a little bit of a dream state thing that happens.
I think
I don't
that's
know.
what it is, because it's like my mind just doesn't fight me as much, and I can just get the words down. And I think too, there's just not a lot you're going to do at 5 or 4 in the morning. Like I'm not going to do laundry. I'm not going to run errands, so there are more things that start to like prevail on me. Like, oh, I've got to go to the grocery store and things like that. But that early in the morning, everybody's still asleep. There's just really something magical, I think, about that time of day. So yeah, so that's kind of like my one thing is that, when I can, I try to get up early and write a little bit in the morning before the day begins.
Oh gosh, I think that's about the time when I'm getting my best REM sleep. But okay, so then do you have like, are you like somebody who's like you try to write a certain number of words? Like how does that work?
Yeah, so 1,000 words would be my goal, but I'm pretty like 1,000 words a day would get a book written in like 100 days, or less. So that's I don't write a book in 100 days. So it's like 1,000 words, give or take. Like there are days that it's just not happening. Like I'm just not feeling it, and I can barely string, full sentence together. And then there are days where the words just flow and I write, 1,500 or 2,000 words. And then there are days that are busy and I never turn the computer on. And so it's just a little, it's all over the place sometimes, but I kind of think like bigger picture, like I'll think, okay, by the end of the year, I want to be, at 40,000 words or whatever, just kind of knowing that somehow I'm going to get there. But I do try to write every day, even if it's only like a 30-minute stretch, because I think if you can at least get the document open and have your eyes on it, it keeps you in the story. Sometimes like around the holidays, for example, like life is going to get busy, I know, and a week or so might go by that I don't open it. But then when you try to get back into it, it's like you've got to reread and really kind of get reacclimated to the story before you can go on.
I know that is exactly right. So when you leave the day, do you tend to sort of like give yourself a few, like a little starter for the next day, like this is where we're heading, or is there anything you do to sort of make the next, day a little easier?
Yeah, so I have found that if I actually like ends in the middle of a scene that's like, it's not done, like I ends with something happening, and with the momentum, like I feel like I could keep writing, but I just make myself stop, because then I'm thinking about it and I'm excited about it and I'm eager to jump back into that scene. Whereas if I start the day, with like a new chapter or something like that, it can feel a little bit more daunting, just to come, how am I going to start fresh and what's going to happen in this next scene? So that's one thing that I do try to do. It's hard sometimes because like when you're really feeling the rhythm,
Like,
it's hard
yeah,
to
finish
no,
it. Right. Yeah. Stop. Yeah. No, that's smart though. That makes a lot of sense to me. And sometimes by nature of time, I end up doing that, but I never actually plan it that way. And now that you say that makes a lot of sense. So when you're learning your characters, do you have a process you go through? Do you like, do you feel like you sort of interview them? Do you use like, I don't do these things, but people use boards and what do you do to kind of get to know, your characters?
It's honestly just like trial and error. I know I too have heard so many writers that have a board or they have like a notebook devoted just to a single character. Or I do none of it. I really just start writing, and I always say, the first couple chapters when I'm writing this character, it's like, it's a stranger, it's just somebody I've just met, and, we're talking, and the conversation is awkward because neither of us knows what to say, and it's a little forced. And that's how I feel when I'm first writing, but then little
Sure.
by little, I think of a line of dialogue or a bit of the character's backstory. And so like, I start to just form a picture of this character. I start to get who they are. And then eventually there comes a point in the book where it's like, this is my good friends, and, we're meeting for coffee, and the conversation flows. And I love that part of the book, because then it's at that point, it's just like these characters are going to lead the story, because I know them so well. It's like, I know exactly where the story is going to go.
Totally. Well, there, you said something about early morning. Your brain doesn't fight you so much. So talk about that. Like, it sounds like you're sort of implying that it's really, if you just sort of cut your brain out of it, it's more your subconscious at work. What?
Yeah. I think that that's exactly what it is, and it's the same thing. I run a lot, and I notice I do like a lot of my plotting when I'm running, and I notice that it's the exact same thing. As soon as I, get a little physically tired and like my brain stops fighting me as much, I feel like I come up with some of my best ideas when I'm on my runs. I think that what you're saying about it's the subconscious that sort of takes over, when I'm at the computer looking at the document, later in the day, and I'm wide awake, and, other things are sort of like muddying my thinking, then it's just not as natural. It just doesn't flow as well. And yes, like sometimes those early morning hours when I write, like I have to go back and add to it and things like that and clean it up. It's far from perfect, but just to get, those ideas down, it gives me so much to work with later on.
And are you somebody who sort of writes and then circles back, or are you more like get to the end and then go back? How does that work for you?
I'm kind of like a hybrid of both, I think.
Yeah.
I know in my mind and in my heart that it's really best to just get it down, because I know, like, I start to doubt myself. If I go back and reread and try to fix things, then I start thinking, oh, this is terrible. Why did I write this? Whereas if I can just plow through, and get it down, because I think that once that self-doubt starts to creep in, it can be a bit paralyzing, when it's
Yeah.
so hard to move forward, when there's something nagging you that, about what you've already written. You want to go back and fix it and perfect it. And so I really do. I try to just keep going. But there are times that, I'll go back and I'll start rereading something, and then I start to edit as I go. So it's a mix of both.
So talk about self-doubt, because I think one of the things that, well, first of all, we all feel it, right? But one of the things I think that makes it a little tougher is the idea that you don't exactly know where your book is going, right?
Yeah.
So, so how do you address the sort of like the moments of panic when you're like, oh my God, is this any good?
Yeah. When you said it before, I meant to comment, but you said before, like, if you did outline, it would save you, might be easier. And I think that all the time, like if I did outline ahead of time, I would know where the story was going. I could think of my twist in advance, and there would be less anxiety. But on the other hand, I think it would take something away from the book too, because I just love that spontaneity of like figuring it out as you go. And I think that for me, it just has a more authentic feel to it. So I do, though. I mean, when I'm writing, until I think of that twist, I am worried. Like
You're
what
like,
happens?
oh no, right.
Right. What happens if this doesn't all come together? What happens if I can't think of a great twist? Or what happens if the twist is like totally implausible and readers aren't going to buy it? And, so there's definitely those voices creeping in all the time, and so that's why I think there's always relief too when I do think of the twist, or kind of figure out how these pieces are going to go together. There's a lot of relief in it too. But yeah, the self-doubt, I mean, I think that that's super prevalent among writers too. And maybe, I think that there's something in our nature, not that we're all the same, but there's something about us, whether it's, being a bit more introverted, or, having that self-doubt, that I think makes us good writers too. But I mean, it's just always there. One day something I wrote is brilliant, the next day it's garbage.
Oh,
And
right.
it
So
just goes,
true.
back and forth, and I think it's hard too, because it's a really, it's not isolating. I love what I do, but like we work by ourselves, with
Yeah,
just us and our imaginations and these fictional characters. And so you don't have kind of that same feedback all the time that you would have at a different job. And it isn't until like I share with my editor and my agent and I start to get that feedback that then, I kind of start to settle, oh, okay, the surprise really did twist them and they love these characters and things like that. And I get that encouragement that I feel like I crave. So it's interesting. I think the one thing I love reading in this genre, like it is my favorite genre to read, but there are times when I'm like knee deep in a book and I have to be really careful what I read, because that's where I can get the self-doubt. Like I read some
sure.
incredible novel and I think, oh my gosh, like I can never do this that well.
I that is like my life right now. I mean, because I'm reading so many of these
Right.
wonderful novels, all these incredibly talented people, but actually, at some point, it kind of wears off. You're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. You just, because you can't say you can't feel. It's like anxiety. You can't feel it all the time, or you just like break. But of course, of course. So, do you send then? Are you, you don't? Sounds like you don't write your whole draft. You send chunks along to your editor and your agent.
So I actually will. I'll finish a whole draft and then I'll
Okay.
send that. I'll send to my agent, my editor, and my husband at the same time. So yeah, I usually, again, just because I will, like if I get into a jam, like with when I was writing Just the Nicest Couple, or like the many versions that came before it,
Right.
then we will brainstorm and talk things through. But if I don't know, I kind of do like for them to be surprised, because I
Yeah.
want the authentic feedback versus them knowing where the story's going.
But it means months and months and months of that sort of like self-doubt and like, oh my God, is this, right? I mean, you're sort of in that perpetual state until the draft is done,
Yeah.
which is,
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, like it can be overwhelming, but I think it can also be motivating too.
yeah,
And, for all the self-doubt, there's also nothing as great as like the rush of feeling like I've got this and it's really moving in the right direction. So there's both.
there is that moment where something clicks and you are just like, yeah, it is. There's probably really nothing like it. I don't know anything that is quite like that. So talk about running. I mean, I think that is a really interesting way. There's something about being physically tired. And I love that too. My mantra is I only run when I'm being chased. So I do not run, but I do, work out. And I think, that helps the sort of the brain process. So when you're running, and you're a distance runner, I mean, you run marathons, right?
Yeah, I do.
Oh my
Yeah.
God, it's so crazy. Mary, I like you so much, but that's so nuts. Um, so when you're taking, you're running probably like, an hour, 2 hours, and what do you do when you have an idea? Like you stop and write it down, or I
I
know, I
I
always wonder.
I don't stop, but I mean maybe I should, or I should do like a voice to audio or voice to text or something. But I will sound, don't judge me, but I will literally start like writing in my head, and
Yeah.
I mean I'll never remember it all when I get home, but but that's honestly how I pass the time, when I'm running, and I'll just, start thinking, okay, like this is what I'm working on. Where could this story go? Or how is this scene going to go? Then I just start thinking. And I do, like, once I come up with an idea, I literally start working out, the dialogue and the narrative in my head. And again, like I said, I'll never remember it all, but bits and pieces I do, and like the overall gist of it, I do. So it's just, I don't know. I've always run since I was like in middle school. And it's just in the
Wow.
last couple of years that, I have got into marathon running. It was supposed to be one, and I'm up to 3 now and registered for the Chicago Marathon next year. So I
I hear
don't,
they're addictive. I hear it's addictive.
it is, and I think the other thing too is like once you run a marathon, it's almost like nothing compares, and I mean it's terrible to say, but
No, I get it. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. And there's, I don't know. The first couple that I ran with a friend. So those long runs were always with a friend, and it was great. And we would chat. And this last year though, she decided not to run. And so I ran by myself. And at first I wasn't sure, like those long Saturday morning runs, they're long, I mean like 2 to 3 hours. And I wasn't sure, wasn't sure
Yeah.
if I could do it.
No.
But then I loved it. I mean, when like the marathon was getting closer and I realized like that time was coming to an end, I started to miss it before it was even gone. So it's so peaceful, and it's one of those things that like when you have, I don't know, I just do for myself, I think that it's
Yeah.
so important for everybody to have something that they do just for themselves. And so for me, that's like the time to get out of the house and have these couple hours just devoted to me.
Right. And I think especially as a mom, right, or a parent in general, but I think there's something, for most of us in traditional, roles, or more traditional roles, that is, where we're sort of the person who manages the house, and, and we're here. So it makes sense for us to be in charge of that kind of stuff, to just get away and be able to sort of be out of that space and just give yourself the time. So are you listening to anything, or are you just silence?
So I will listen to music.
Yeah.
I have tried audiobooks. I wish so much that I could do audiobooks when I run, but I can't. And I think that the music is good because then I can still think,
Yeah. Yeah.
with the audiobooks, I'd have to be just so tuned into them so I
Yeah.
don't lose track of the story. But I do listen to music because without it, I can hear how like heavy I'm breathing. And
Yeah, right. You just need, like, you'd have to have like headphones that make it all silent, so you don't realize how much you're torturing yourself. Well, and it's funny because I love audiobooks, and it's a way to read, especially outside the genre, because I'm reading so much in the genre for the podcast. But it's not the same as just being in your own brain. I find if I really need to brainstorm something for my story, you can't be listening to somebody else's story, right?
It's so true. Yeah, I totally agree. And I do love when I'm not running, like if I'm in the car or cleaning the house or whatever, I do love audiobooks. I was never sure like if I would have the attention span for them, but then a friend years ago got me hooked on podcasts. That was like
Yeah.
my first baby step into it, and I found that I loved it, and so then I switched over to audiobooks. And I mean, it's just a great way. I usually have like an audiobook going and a physical book that I'm reading, and it's just such a great way to be able to absorb that much more.
Me too. Me too. I do love it, but I do think there's something special. I kind of like hearing you talk about the run and imagining what that's like to be out. Out. It kind of makes me wish I could run. I have to think
There
about it. Maybe I could cross country ski. That would be maybe
you
more
go.
my
Yeah.
speed. So, okay. So, what is next, Mary? What are you working on now?
Yeah, so I am working on my next book. I'm about halfway done with it. I don't want to say too much
No.
about it just because
Right.
it's still, in like its infancy, and I don't know exactly how it's all going to go. But I will say I'm super excited about it. I'm like writing like I wrote before this book, so I no false starts, none of that. So that's been a huge relief. I'm hoping to have a draft done by the early spring, and I would guess that it'd be out in 2024 sometime.
So exciting. Well, it's nice to know. It's probably just really reassuring to know that when the world has gone back to whatever is the new normal, the writing has also gone back.
I completely agree because there was panic, like is this me or is this just like the world's and everything that's going on? So it's been such a relief to be able to, just go back to that and just kind of, I've always loved writing, but it was just so hard for that time period. So just to have that energy and excitement again has been so great.
Oh my God, it's so fabulous. Okay, well, so the Just the Nicest Couple is out on January 10th. There are so many books coming out on January 10th.
I know.
It's
I
kind
know.
of crazy. Well, so this is also our first podcast for 2023. So thank you, Mary, for being, starting us off another exciting year of Killer Women. Tell everybody this is available for pre-order now. Tell everybody where they can find you on social media, what your website is, in case people want to follow you, and spell Kubica for us because it is not the easiest.
It is not. Okay, so my website is marykubica.com, and it's Kubica. And I'm on Twitter, just at Mary Kubica. I'm on Facebook and I'm on Instagram. That's at Mary Kubica as well. But if you go to my website, there are links for all the social media there.
Fantastic. And remind me, Mary, I know you have a bunch of books. How many books if you haven't discovered Mary yet and you start, how many books are there?
So Just the Nicest Couple is number 8.
Congratulations. Well, that's super exciting. And there's so many. I actually have Local Women missing upstairs and I just have to get to it. So I'm really excited. Mary, I love your books. Thank you so much for joining us today. This has been Killer Women, and we will see you next time. Bye.